Before there was winter, there was only spring. Imagine that for a moment. A world where nothing ever died, where flowers bloomed eternally, where the earth never turned cold or barren. No autumn leaves falling, no frozen ground, no waiting through dark months for warmth to return. Just endless growth, endless light, endless life. And then one day, a young goddess reached for a flower, and everything changed. Winter was born, death entered the world, and humanity learned what it meant to lose something you love. But here's what almost no one tells you about this story. The god who caused it all, Hades, Lord of the Dead, wasn't actually a villain. In fact, ancient Greeks rarely even spoke his name aloud, not because they hated him, but because of something far stranger. They called him by euphemisms, indirect titles, careful phrases that avoided naming death directly. And the young goddess he abducted, she didn't remain a victim. Within months, she became one of the most powerful and feared deities in the entire Greek pantheon. Someone even Zeus had to respect. Someone mortals prayed to for mercy when facing their own deaths. The girl who picked flowers in eternal spring transformed into the dread queen of the underworld. And that transformation reveals something the ancient Greeks understood that we've largely forgotten. This isn't just a story about the changing seasons, though it is that. It's not just about a mother's grief, though Demeter's sorrow literally unmade the world. This myth became the foundation of the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most important religious experience in ancient Greece for nearly 2,000 years. Thousands upon thousands of people, from slaves to emperors, philosophers to soldiers, walked 14 miles from Athens to Eleusis to participate in secret rituals so transformative that everyone who experienced them claimed they would never fear death again. Not one person in 2 millennia ever broke their vow of secrecy about what happened in that darkened hall. What could possibly be powerful enough to command that kind of silence? The answer lies in understanding not just the story, but what it meant to the Greeks, what it reveals about the nature of death and transformation, and why a myth about pomegranate seeds eaten in darkness became the key to conquering humanity's greatest fear. Tonight, we'll journey through this ancient tale as the Greeks themselves told it, discovering along the way that almost everything you think you know about Hades and Persephone is incomplete. The real story is stranger, darker, and ultimately more hopeful than the simplified version that survives in modern retellings. So let your breathing slow, settle into the darkness, and prepare to discover a world before winter. A world that was about to change forever, on the day a maiden named Kor reached for the most beautiful flower she had ever seen. The world before winter. Long before humans marked time by the turning of seasons. Before they understood that leaves must fall and flowers must wither. Before they knew the ache of waiting through barren months for spring's return, there existed a world without winter. This was the world of Demeter and her daughter. A world governed by the goddess who made all things grow, who held dominion over grain and harvest, over every sprouting seed and ripening fruit, over the fundamental principle of nourishment that kept humanity alive. Demeter was one of the original Olympians, daughter of the Titans Cronus and Rhea, sister to Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, and Hestia. Like most of her siblings except Zeus, she had been swallowed whole by their father shortly after birth, kept prisoner in his belly until Zeus freed them all and led the war against the Titans. From that violent beginning came the Olympian order, and Demeter found her place as the goddess most essential to mortal survival. Without Zeus, there might be chaos in the heavens. Without Poseidon, the seas might rage, unchecked. But without Demeter, quite simply, nothing would grow, and every living thing would starve. Her power was both gentle and absolute. She walked through fields, and they turned golden with wheat. She touched barren soil, and it became fertile. She blessed the planting and the harvest, the threshing and the grinding, every stage of the agricultural cycle that allowed civilization to exist. Cities built temples in her honor. Farmers made offerings before every planting season, praying that she would look favorably upon their work. She was not a goddess of dramatic myths and passionate affairs like some of her siblings, but rather a goddess of constancy, of the reliable patterns that allowed life to continue, generation after generation. And she had a daughter, the most precious thing in her world. The girl's name was Kor, which means simply maiden or daughter in ancient Greek. Some sources suggest she had other names, but in the earliest tellings, she was Kor, defined entirely by her youth, her potential, her relationship to her mother. She represented everything pure and unspoiled, everything that had not yet bloomed into its fullest expression. Where Demeter was the harvest, Kor was the seed. Where Demeter was mature abundance, Kor was youthful promise. The Homeric Hymn to Demeter, our most complete ancient source for this myth, written in the 7th or 6th century BCE, describes Kor as having delicate ankles, a phrase that appears repeatedly in Greek poetry to denote feminine grace and youth. She was beautiful in the way that spring flowers are beautiful, fresh and bright and seemingly eternal in her innocence. She spent her days in the company of other young goddesses and nymphs, the daughters of Oceanus with their girdles slung low, picking flowers in soft meadows, playing and laughing in eternal sunshine. Their world was one of perpetual spring and summer. The hymn doesn't explicitly state this, but the implication runs through every line of the opening passage. Flowers bloomed continuously. The meadows were always soft and green. There was no sense of time passing, no cycle of growth and decay, just endless abundance overseen by a goddess who loved her daughter more than anything else in creation. Demeter and Kor were inseparable, two aspects of the same principle: youth and maturity, seed and harvest, daughter and mother bound together in a relationship that seemed as eternal as the growing things themselves. What neither of them knew was that their perfect world had already attracted unwanted attention. And here's where the story becomes more complicated than most retellings admit. The plan to shatter their happiness didn't originate with the god of the underworld alone. But in the shadowy realm far beneath the earth, a figure watched. Hades, lord of the dead, king of the underworld, the unseen god who ruled over all the souls that had departed from life, had noticed the maiden picking flowers. What he felt, looking up from his dark kingdom toward the world of light and growth and laughter, appears to have been something deeper than casual desire. The ancient sources, including Hesiod's Theogony from the 8th century BCE, tell us Hades rarely left his realm. He had no queen to share his throne. His kingdom was populated entirely by the dead, by shadows and shades who could neither speak with their former clarity nor feel with their former intensity. He was the wealthiest of all the gods, for all the precious metals and gems of the earth belonged to him. But his wealth brought him no warmth, no companionship, no light in the eternal darkness of his domain. He wanted Kor. He wanted her brightness in his darkness, her laughter in his silent halls, her youth to break the monotony of endless death. But he knew, as all the gods knew, that Demeter would never willingly allow her daughter to descend to the underworld, to marry the god of death, to leave the sunlit meadows for the shadowed realm below. Demeter would refuse, would fight, would turn the world to dust before allowing such a thing. So Hades made a choice that reveals something crucial about how power worked on Olympus. He went to Zeus. The Homeric Hymn is explicit about this detail, though many modern retellings gloss over it. Hades asked Zeus, the king of the gods and Kor's father, for permission to marry the maiden, and Zeus, for reasons the ancient sources never fully explain, agreed. The hymn states clearly that Zeus gave her away, using language that reflects ancient Greek marriage customs, where fathers held complete authority over their daughters' marriages, regardless of what the daughters or their mothers might want. Think about what this means. The abduction wasn't a crime in Zeus's eyes. It was an arranged marriage. Zeus had the legal authority, by the standards of his time and culture, to give his daughter to his brother without consulting either Kor or Demeter. The violation wasn't that Hades took her, but that he did so with the blessing of the most powerful god in the cosmos. This wasn't one god defying divine law. This was divine law functioning exactly as it was designed to function, with women as property to be exchanged between male relatives. The hymn tells us Zeus gave his consent, then went about his business, apparently unconcerned about the consequences. Based on the text's silence about his motivations, we might infer he simply didn't think carefully about what Demeter would do when she discovered her daughter was gone. Or perhaps, more disturbingly, he knew Demeter would be upset, but assumed she would eventually accept the marriage as appropriate. After all, Hades was his brother, a king in his own right, ruler of a third of the cosmos. By the patriarchal logic of Olympus, this was actually a prestigious match. Zeus's miscalculation would nearly destroy the world. With Zeus's permission secured, Hades set his trap. The Homeric Hymn describes this with remarkable specificity. He enlisted the help of Gaia, the primordial earth herself, to create a flower so beautiful, so extraordinary, that Kor would not be able to resist reaching for it. This wasn't just any blossom. According to the hymn, it was a narcissus with 100 blooms growing from a single root, radiating a fragrance so sweet and powerful that the whole wide heaven above and the whole earth laughed in the salt wave of the sea. The language suggests something unnatural, something that made even the cosmos itself react with delight, or perhaps cruel amusement at what was about to happen. And on that fateful day, as Kor wandered the meadow with her companions, the hymn names them specifically, the daughters of Oceanus, along with Athena and Artemis, both powerful goddesses in their own right, picking roses and crocuses, violets and irises, hyacinths, and every beautiful thing that grew in that perpetual spring. Then she saw it, the narcissus, the most beautiful flower she had ever seen, blooming alone in a spot that Gaia had prepared specifically for this moment, calling to her with its impossible beauty. She reached out with both hands to pluck it. The hymn emphasizes this detail, both hands, suggesting how drawn she was to it, how completely it captivated her attention. She had no way of knowing that the ground beneath her feet was already beginning to open, that Hades was rising from the depths at that very moment, that her life as she knew it was ending with that single, innocent gesture. What happened next, the hymn tells us, was witnessed by only two beings. Hecate, the goddess associated with magic and crossroads, heard Kor's scream from her cave, but could not see who took her. And Helios, the sun god who sees everything under his light, witnessed the entire abduction from his position crossing the sky. But crucially, Helios said nothing, did nothing, simply watched as the maiden was dragged down to the underworld. Whether his silence came from respecting Zeus's authority or from simple indifference, the hymn doesn't tell us. But his inaction meant that when Demeter began searching for her daughter, no one could immediately tell her what had happened. The earth opens. The moment Kor's fingers touched the narcissus stem, the Homeric Hymn tells us, the wide-pathed earth gaped open in the plain of Nysa. Up from that chasm came Hades, driving his immortal horses. The text describes him as the host of many, one of the euphemistic titles Greeks used to avoid speaking his direct name. He seized the unwilling maiden and carried her off weeping in his golden chariot. Kor screamed. The hymn is explicit about her terror and resistance. She cried out shrilly with her voice, calling upon her father, the son of Kronos, who is most high and excellent. But Zeus was far away, and the text implies, chose not to respond. He had already given his consent to this marriage. Her cries were expected, perhaps part of the ritual of ancient Greek marriage, where brides were often taken from their families with ceremonial shows of resistance. But Zeus had no intention of intervening. She called to her mother, but Demeter was not there in the meadow. The other goddesses and nymphs scattered in terror, unable or unwilling to stand against the Lord of the Dead. The hymn emphasizes Kor's isolation in this moment. She screamed for help, but no help came. The two most powerful figures in her life, her father and her mother, were both absent, Zeus by choice and Demeter by terrible chance. The chariot descended as quickly as it had risen. According to the hymn, the earth closed again over them. The rent in the ground sealed itself, leaving the meadow looking exactly as it had moments before, soft and green and beautiful, flowers swaying gently in the breeze. Only a scattered bouquet remained where Kor had been gathering blossoms, and the companions who had fled in terror, silent testimony to the violence that had just shattered their eternal spring. The ancient Greeks had various traditions about where this abduction occurred. The Homeric Hymn mentions the plain of Nysa, a mythical location that scholars believe was meant to evoke a distant liminal space rather than a real geographical place. Later sources placed it in Sicily, particularly near Mount Etna, where Hades was believed to have entrances to his realm. Still others claimed it happened near Eleusis itself, or in Attica, near Athens. The variation in location suggests this was understood as a mythical event that could have happened anywhere, that the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was thin everywhere, not confined to a single spot. What we know for certain from the hymn is what happened next: absolute silence. Demeter had not been there to see her daughter taken. She knew only that Kor had not returned from picking flowers. And as the hours passed, as the day ended, and still no daughter appeared, as twilight fell and the meadow grew dark and empty, a terrible dread began to grow in the goddess's heart. Something was wrong. Kor would never stay away this long. And somewhere deep in Demeter's divine awareness, though she didn't yet know the specifics, she understood that her world had just been shattered beyond recognition. The journey to the underworld, like all journeys between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, was one way by design. The underworld was not simply a place, but a state of being, a fundamental transformation from living to dead, from present to past, from light to shadow. Its entrance was guarded not to keep intruders out, but to keep its residents in. Once you passed through those gates, once you crossed the river Styx with the ferryman Charon, once you moved past the three-headed dog Cerberus, whose job was to ensure no shade ever escaped, you were in the realm of Hades, and only the god himself could release you. What did Kor feel during that descent? The ancient sources don't tell us, focusing instead on Demeter's grief and search. But we can imagine the terror of being dragged down into darkness, away from everything she had ever known, from her mother's protection and the company of her friends, from the meadows and flowers and sunlight that had been her entire world. She had gone from the realm of endless growth to the realm of eternal stillness, from life to a kind of living death, from maiden to reluctant queen. When the chariot finally stopped, Kor found herself in Hades' palace, deep in the underworld, surrounded by the dead. The hymn tells us she was much under duress and suffering from unbearable things inflicted on her by the will of the Blessed Ones, a phrase that suggests both her emotional state and the Greek worldview that the gods could inflict suffering that mortals, and even lesser immortals, simply had to endure. She yearned for her mother, longed for the upper world, but she was trapped in a realm designed to be inescapable, held there by a god who had desired her enough to steal her away from everything she loved. A mother's grief unmakes the world. The Homeric Hymn gives us a precise timeline. Demeter searched for 9 days. Not the kind of searching where you look in expected places and then give up, but 9 days of continuous, desperate wandering that consumed everything she was. She held torches in her hands, according to the text, searching both day and night. For 9 days, she neither ate nor drank, neither bathed nor rested. The hymn emphasizes her transformed state. The goddess who had presided over abundance and nourishment was now refusing both for herself, her grief overriding even her divine nature. But here's what makes this detail so striking. Demeter didn't know where to search. She ranged over the earth with her torches, but she had no direction, no clue about what had happened. The hymn tells us that no one, god or mortal, would tell her the truth. They remained silent, whether from fear of Zeus's authority or simple ignorance. So Demeter wandered blindly, desperately, searching every corner of the world for a daughter who was no longer in the world of the living at all. On the 10th day, something changed. Hecate, the goddess who had heard but not seen the abduction, approached Demeter with the partial truth. She had heard Kor's cry, but she didn't know who had taken her. The two goddesses went together to Helios, the sun god who sees everything that happens under his light. And here the hymn gives us one of its most powerful confrontations. Demeter demanded to know what had happened to her daughter. Helios told her everything. Zeus had given Kor to Hades. The girl had been dragged down to the underworld to become the bride of death. She now ruled below the earth as queen of the dead. And then Helios, perhaps trying to comfort the grieving mother, or perhaps simply stating what he saw as fact, told Demeter something that reveals how completely he misunderstood the situation. Hades was not an unfitting husband. He was powerful, respected, Zeus's own brother, ruler of a third of the cosmos. Kor should consider herself fortunate to make such a match. This was meant to console. According to the hymn, it had the opposite effect. Demeter's reaction went far beyond sorrow. The text states that a more terrible and savage grief seized her heart. Her daughter had been stolen, given away like property by Zeus without any consultation, taken to a realm from which no living thing could return. And she was being told to accept this as somehow appropriate, as a good match, as if Kor's desires or her own feelings mattered not at all. What Demeter did next was unprecedented in the history of the cosmos. The hymn tells us she stayed apart from the assembly of the gods, refusing to return to Olympus or to resume her divine duties. This wasn't just a personal strike or emotional withdrawal. This was a goddess who controlled all agriculture, deliberately abandoning her responsibilities, knowing exactly what the consequences would be, and the consequences were catastrophic. The text describes it with devastating simplicity. Demeter made the year most terrible and cruel for mankind upon the all-nourishing earth. She would not make the grain sprout from the seed. Think about what this means. Every seed planted in the ground simply rotted. Nothing grew. Nothing sprouted. Nothing ripened. The world that had known only abundance suddenly faced total agricultural collapse, and with it, mass starvation. But here's the twist that makes Demeter's actions even more complex. She wasn't simply overcome by grief, unable to function. She was fully aware of what she was doing. The hymn makes clear this was a deliberate choice, a conscious threat directed at Zeus and the entire divine order. She vowed she would never set foot on Olympus, or allow fruit to spring from the earth until she saw her daughter with her own eyes, until Kor was returned to her. This was divine blackmail on a cosmic scale. Return my daughter, or watch humanity perish. She refused. With a decisiveness that shook the foundations of the divine order, Demeter abandoned Olympus entirely. She swore she would never return to the company of the gods, never again take her seat in Zeus's hall, never resume her divine duties until she saw her daughter with her own eyes, until Kor was returned to her, until the wrong was righted, and her child restored. The hymn tells us she made her way to Eleusis, a city about 14 miles northwest of Athens, and there, still disguised as an old woman, she sat by a well called the Maiden's Well. The daughters of King Celeus found her there and, taking pity on what appeared to be an elderly stranger, brought her to their mother, Metaneira, who had recently given birth to a son named Demephon. Metaneira hired the disguised goddess as a nurse for the child. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that reveals something profound about Greek concepts of divinity and immortality. Demeter, grateful for the kindness this family had shown her even in her grief, decided to repay them by making the child immortal. But the process she chose, according to the hymn, was extraordinary and terrifying to mortal eyes. Each night, Demeter held the infant in the fire, burning away his mortal nature bit by bit, replacing it with something divine. The hymn describes it as anointing him with ambrosia during the day, and then hiding him in the heart of the fire at night, as it were a brand, without his dear parents' knowledge. This was not a metaphor. The goddess was literally placing the baby in flames as part of a ritual transformation that would have made him immortal and eternally young. The ritual required secrecy and absolute trust. It didn't get it. Metaneira, the child's mother, witnessed the ceremony one night. Seeing her infant in the fire, she did what any mother would do. She screamed in terror. And that scream, that understandable human reaction, shattered the ritual at a crucial moment. The hymn states that Demeter, in a rage, put the dear child from her on the ground and revealed herself in her full divine glory, growing tall, shedding her old woman disguise, filling the palace with light. Demeter's words to Metaneira reveal her frustration and the permanence of what the interruption had cost. Because of the mother's interference, Demephon would now remain mortal. He would grow old and die like all humans. The gift of immortality had been within the family's grasp, and they had lost it through lack of trust and understanding. The hymn suggests this as a kind of tragedy, a near miss that defined the boundary between divine and mortal existence. But Demeter didn't leave Eleusis empty-handed, or the family without recompense. Though she could no longer make Demephon immortal, she promised to teach the people of Eleusis sacred rites, mysteries that would later become the famous Eleusinian Mysteries. She commanded them to build her a temple, and she withdrew into it, sitting alone with her grief while the world above continued to wither under her deliberate neglect. The crops failed entirely now. Nothing would grow. Seeds planted in the ground rotted instead of sprouting. Plants that had been green turned brown and died. Trees bore no fruit. Animals began to starve as their food sources disappeared. Humans, dependent on agriculture for survival, faced famine on a scale they had never known. A hunger that threatened to wipe out entire populations, entire cities, the entire mortal race. The gods watched this disaster unfold with growing alarm. Zeus sent messenger after messenger to Demeter, offering gifts, offering honors, offering anything she might want if only she would return to Olympus and allow the world to grow again. She refused every offer. She would not negotiate. She would not compromise. She had one demand, and one demand only: return her daughter, or watch the world die. The other gods realized, with mounting horror, that she meant it absolutely. This was not a negotiation. This was an ultimatum. Return Kor, or humanity would perish, and with humanity, all the sacrifices and prayers and offerings that the gods received from mortal worship would cease. The gods would not die, but they would lose the honor and attention they had grown accustomed to, the temples and festivals and constant stream of devotion that made divine life meaningful. Zeus, faced with the extinction of humanity and the stubborn fury of his sister, finally relented. He could not simply order Demeter to relent. She had made clear that no amount of divine authority would sway her. he could not force her to make things grow. Her power came from her willing cooperation, not from compulsion. The only solution was to undo what had been done, to return Kor to her mother, to admit that the original arrangement, made without Demeter's knowledge or consent, had been a mistake of catastrophic proportions. Zeus sent Hermes, the messenger god, down to the underworld with a command for Hades: release the girl, or face the consequences of a dead world above. The Lord of the Dead. To understand what happened next, to make sense of the compromise that would ultimately be reached, and the way it would reshape both the divine order and the mortal experience of time itself, we must first understand Hades, the god who had started this entire catastrophe with his desire for a bride he had no right to take. Hades was one of the original Olympian generation, son of the Titans Cronus and Rhea, brother to Zeus, Poseidon, Demeter, Hera, and Hestia. He was, in fact, the eldest of the male children, the first son, though he had also been the first, swallowed by his father, and thus the last to be regurgitated when Zeus freed his siblings. After the war against the Titans, when the three brothers divided up the cosmos between them, Hades received the underworld, while Zeus took the heavens, and Poseidon claimed the seas. The earth itself they shared, though Hades rarely ventured to the surface, content or perhaps resigned to rule over his dark kingdom far from the light of the sun. The ancient Greeks had complex feelings about Hades. He was not, strictly speaking, an evil god. He did not torture souls or delight in suffering. He was not the Greek equivalent of Satan or the devil. Those Christian concepts would come much later and reflected very different theological ideas. Hades was simply the administrator of death, the keeper of the dead, the god who ruled over the inevitable destination of every living thing. His realm was not primarily a place of punishment, though it did have sections for the wicked, but rather the final destination for all souls, regardless of their virtue or vice. Homer describes Hades as pitiless and inexorable, qualities that reflect his fundamental nature as death itself, unavoidable, unswayable, immune to prayers or bribes or tears. Everyone died eventually. Everyone came to his realm. He could not be bargained with or persuaded to make exceptions, and this made him simultaneously respected and feared. The Greeks did not hate Hades for being cruel. They feared him for being utterly fair and absolutely final. When you died, you went to his kingdom, and there you stayed, and Hades made sure no one ever escaped, that the boundary between life and death remained inviolate. But this same quality that made Hades a just and reliable keeper of the dead also made him profoundly lonely. He was the only major Olympian god who did not reside on Mount Olympus, and his kingdom was populated entirely by the dead, by shades and shadows who could neither laugh nor cry with their former intensity, whose capacity for relationship and conversation and companionship had been diminished by their transition from life to death. Hades sat on his throne in his palace deep underground, surrounded by immense wealth, for all the gold and gems and precious metals of the earth belonged to him, and he was utterly, completely alone. The Greeks sometimes called him Pluton, meaning the wealthy one, or the giver of wealth, a euphemistic title that emphasized his control over the riches hidden beneath the earth, rather than his role as Lord of the Dead. They avoided speaking his name directly, treating it with the same superstitious caution that medieval Christians would later treat the word hell, as if speaking of death might somehow invite it to notice you. When they had to refer to him, they used epithets and titles: the host of many, the renowned one, the unseen, Zeus of the underworld. This last title is particularly telling, as it suggests Hades held authority in his realm equivalent to Zeus's authority in heaven, a king in his own right ruling a kingdom that, while dark and final, was nonetheless a third of the entire cosmos. Ancient art rarely depicted Hades, and when it did, he appeared as a mature, bearded figure, solemn and dignified, often holding a scepter or key, sometimes wearing a helmet that rendered him invisible. He was frequently shown seated on his throne with Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the gates of the underworld, at his feet. Unlike Zeus with his dramatic lightning bolts, or Poseidon with his earth-shaking trident, Hades had no flashy powers or displays. He simply was what he was: final, inescapable, the end that awaits everything that lives. This was the god who desired core, not from malice or cruelty, but from a loneliness so profound that when he saw the bright maiden picking flowers, saw her laughing with her companions in the eternal spring of the upper world, he wanted her with a desperation that made him willing to violate every principle of consent and choice and right relationship. He did not ask if she wanted to come to his kingdom. He did not court her or try to win her affection. He simply took her, with Zeus's permission, but without hers, and brought her to a place she could never leave, to share a throne she had never sought, to become queen of a realm she had never wanted to rule. The ancient sources do not explore Hades' motivations deeply. They tell us what he did, but not why, leaving us to infer his emotional state from his actions and the few words attributed to him in the various tellings. But we can recognize in his behavior a pattern that appears again and again in Greek mythology. The powerful taking what they want from the less powerful, gods helping themselves to mortals and lesser divinities, desire becoming justification, and the consequences falling most heavily on those who had the least choice in the matter. Seeds of binding. When Hermes arrived in the underworld bearing Zeus's command that core be released, the Homeric Hymn paints a specific scene. He found Hades seated on a couch, and beside him sat Persephone, as she was now called in her role as queen. The hymn describes her as shy and much reluctant because she yearned for her mother. She had spent months in the underworld by this point. The text doesn't specify exactly how long, but enough time for Demeter's strike to devastate the mortal world. Despite being called queen, despite sitting beside the king of the dead, she was not there by choice, and her desire to leave was as strong as it had been on the day she was taken. Hades listened to Hermes' message, and the hymn tells us something revealing about his reaction. He smiled grimly with his brows. Different translators render this phrase in various ways, but all suggest something complex, not simple acceptance or disappointment, but perhaps a knowing acknowledgement that he had prepared for this possibility. He agreed to release Persephone. He did not openly defy Zeus's command, but he also didn't let her go without ensuring she would return. What happened next is described in the Homeric Hymn, but the text leaves crucial details ambiguous in ways that scholars have debated for centuries. According to the hymn, Hades secretly gave her sweet pomegranate seed to eat. That word secretly is intriguing because it appears in some manuscripts, but not others. Some versions suggest she ate it without knowing what she was doing. Others imply she knew, but was somehow compelled. The hymn itself puts the explanation in Persephone's own words when she later tells her mother what happened. She says Hades gave me a pomegranate seed, sweet to eat, and compelled me against my will to taste it. This phrasing suggests coercion, but doesn't clarify whether the compulsion was physical force, trickery, or perhaps the complex pressure of a situation where she had no real choice. The number of seeds varies wildly across ancient sources, which tells us something important about how this detail functioned in Greek storytelling. The Homeric Hymn doesn't actually specify a number, leaving it vague. Pseudo-Apollodorus, writing in the 2nd century CE, mentions a pomegranate seed, but again doesn't give a specific number. Later sources settled on varying counts. Some say 3, some say 6, creating a neat division of the year. Some say 7. A few late sources even claim she ate an entire pomegranate. This variation suggests the exact number was less important than the act itself and its consequences. What all sources agree on is that there was an ancient rule, never fully explained in surviving texts, but clearly understood by Greeks who told this story. If you ate anything in the underworld, you became bound to it. You could not leave permanently. You were tied forever to the realm of the dead. Why did this rule exist? The ancient sources don't explain it directly, leaving us to piece together what it might have meant. One possibility, drawing from the hymn's context and other Greek myths about the underworld, is that eating created a bond of hospitality and belonging. In Greek culture, sharing food with someone created obligations and connections. To eat someone's food was to accept their hospitality, to become, in a sense, part of their household. If that principle applied in the underworld, eating even a single seed from that realm would create an unbreakable connection to it and to its king. Another interpretation, supported by the association of Hades with wealth and precious minerals from beneath the earth, is that the pomegranate seeds represented something from the underworld's own substance. By consuming them, Persephone had taken the realm of death inside herself, literally incorporating it into her being in a way that could not be reversed. But here's a detail that often gets overlooked. In some ancient Greek traditions, pomegranate seeds were associated with marriage ceremonies. The fruit appeared at weddings as a symbol of fertility and the binding nature of marital vows. If Hades gave Persephone pomegranate seeds, he may have been enacting a marriage ritual, making their union official not through the abduction Zeus had sanctioned, but through her consumption of a traditional wedding symbol. Whether she understood this symbolism or was tricked by it, the hymn doesn't tell us. But the implications are striking. The seeds might have represented Persephone's inadvertent or coerced participation in her own marriage ceremony. Why this rule existed, we can only speculate. Perhaps it reflected the idea that the dead needed nourishment from the underworld itself to survive in that realm. And once you accepted that nourishment, you became part of that ecosystem, no longer fully belonging to the world of the living. Perhaps it was a magical principle, a binding created through the act of consuming something from a particular place. Perhaps it was simply a narrative device, a way to explain why Persephone could not completely escape Hades' realm, why the compromise between life and death between mother and husband, between the world above and the world below, could never be absolute. The pomegranate itself carried rich symbolic weight in ancient Mediterranean cultures, and its choice as the binding fruit in this myth wasn't arbitrary. Native to regions farther east, likely Iran or Afghanistan, based on archaeological evidence, it had been traded and cultivated throughout the Mediterranean for centuries before the Homeric Hymn was composed, probably in the 7th or 6th century BCE. Its unusual structure made it distinctive, a tough outer rind containing hundreds of jewel-like seeds, each surrounded by translucent, blood-red flesh. No wonder it appeared in art and religious contexts as a symbol of both fertility and death, of life-giving abundance and blood sacrifice. In Greek culture, pomegranates appeared at wedding ceremonies as symbols of fertility and the binding nature of marriage. In Jewish tradition, pomegranates decorated priestly robes and temple architecture, representing abundance and divine blessing. In Persian mythology, the fruit connected to cycles of seasons and journeys between worlds. When the Greeks incorporated the pomegranate into this particular myth, they were drawing on a deep well of symbolic meanings from across the Mediterranean and Near East, making the fruit simultaneously a marker of marriage, a binding agent that tied Persephone to the underworld's king, and a symbol rich enough to carry multiple layers of meaning. But there's another detail in the myth that reveals something important about how the ancient Greeks understood witnessing and testimony. According to Pseudo-Apollodorus and other later sources, someone saw Persephone eat the pomegranate seeds. Ascalaphus, described as the son of the underworld river Acheron and the nymph Gorgyra, or in some versions as an orchardist who tended Hades' pomegranate groves. When Demeter later tried to argue that Persephone could return permanently, Ascalaphus testified that he had seen her eat, making her consumption a matter of witnessed record rather than just Hades' word against hers. For his testimony, Persephone, or in some versions, Demeter, punished him severely. One tradition says Demeter placed a heavy rock on top of him in the underworld, pinning him beneath its weight. Another says Persephone transformed him into a screech owl, a bird associated with death and ill omen. This punishment of the witness reveals something about the emotional complexity of the situation. Whether Persephone ate willingly or unwillingly, someone's testimony that she ate at all ensured she could never fully escape the underworld. Ascalaphus's honesty became, in the eyes of the goddesses, a betrayal worth eternal punishment. The moment she swallowed those seeds, whenever and however it happened, Persephone's fate was sealed. Not completely, as we'll see, but partially. She would not be able to return permanently to the world above. She would remain, connected to Hades and to the underworld, bound by the food she had consumed, by the nourishment she had accepted from that dark realm. The maiden who had been taken against her will had now, through eating, become complicit in her own captivity, though the sources disagree about whether she understood what she was doing or was tricked into it. There is something deeply troubling about this detail in the myth, something that generations of readers and scholars have struggled with. If Persephone ate unknowingly, she was betrayed twice, first by being abducted, then by being tricked into ensuring her own continued captivity. If she ate knowing the consequences, the myth raises difficult questions about choice made under duress, about what it means to consent to something, when the alternative is perpetual separation from everyone you love, when your mother's grief is destroying the world, when you are utterly powerless and looking for any agency you can claim, even if that agency only allows you to choose the terms of your imprisonment rather than escape it entirely. Some modern interpreters have suggested that the eating of the pomegranate seeds represents Persephone's transition from maiden to woman, from Kor the child to Persephone the queen, from innocent victim to knowing participant in her own story. In this reading, the seeds mark a transformation, a loss of innocence certainly, but also a gaining of knowledge, authority, and a kind of dark wisdom that comes from dwelling in the realm of death. The girl who went down might not have chosen to go, but the queen who emerged had made choices of her own, had claimed what power she could in a situation not of her making, had become something more than the passive maiden picking flowers who had existed before. The ancient Greeks themselves seem to have understood the pomegranate as representing this binding, this connection between the upper world and the underworld that could not be severed once it had been established. Persephone had tasted death, quite literally, and that taste could not be forgotten or erased. She would carry it with her forever, a mark of her time below, a sign that she had crossed the boundary between the realms of the living and the dead, and could never fully return to one or the other. She would exist between worlds, belonging completely to neither, moving between them in a cycle that would continue as long as the world itself endured. The compromise that created winter. The reunion between Demeter and Persephone is described in the Homeric Hymn with extraordinary emotional intensity. When Demeter saw her daughter returning from the underworld with Hermes, the text says she rushed forth as does a maenad down some thick wooded mountain. This comparison to a maenad, one of the ecstatic female followers of Dionysus, known for their wild, uncontrolled behavior, suggests something beyond ordinary divine comportment. Demeter's joy was overwhelming, primal, beyond the bounds of normal restraint. Persephone, seeing her mother's beloved face after months of yearning, leaped down to run to her, and falling upon her neck, embraced her. The hymn emphasizes the physicality of this moment, the desperate clinging of mother and daughter finally reunited, each holding the other as if they would never let go. For those first moments, they simply held each other, and their joy seemed complete. But Demeter's happiness was shadowed almost immediately by fear. The hymn describes how her heart suddenly misgave her for some snare. She had learned, perhaps from Hermes, or perhaps from divine intuition, that eating anything in the underworld would prevent a complete return. So even as she embraced her daughter, even as she wept with relief and joy, Demeter ceased fondling her daughter and asked of her at once, The question itself reveals everything about what hung in the balance. My child, tell me, surely you have not tasted any food while you were sus. Below? Speak out and hide nothing, but let us both know. For if you have not, you shall come back from loathly Hades and live with me and your father, the dark-clouded son of Kronos, and be honored by all the deathless gods. But if you have tasted food, you must go back again beneath the secret places of the earth, there to dwell a third part of the seasons every year. Notice the precision of the Homeric Hymn here. 1/3 of the year, not half. This detail matters because it shows how the myth evolved over time. The earliest version, preserved in the hymn, has Persephone spending 2/3 of the year with her mother, and 1/3 with Hades. Later sources, perhaps seeking a neater symbolic division or influenced by different regional traditions, would change this to 6 months each, a perfect split between upper and lower worlds. But the original compromise was more generous to Demeter. She would have her daughter for most of the year, losing her only for the period that, in Mediterranean agriculture, corresponds to the dry summer months when crops don't grow anyway. Persephone answered honestly. The hymn gives us her own voice, one of the few places where we hear her speak directly about her experience. She recounted the abduction, how the earth opened, how Hades seized her, how she was taken down to the underworld against her will. Then she explained what had happened with the pomegranate. He secretly gave me a pomegranate seed, sweet to eat, and compelled me against my will to taste it. That phrase, compelled me against my will, is crucial. It suggests Persephone did not eat willingly or freely. Whether Hades physically forced her, tricked her, or created circumstances where she felt she had no choice, the text makes clear she did not want to eat the seed. This matters because it means her binding to the underworld was not her choice, not her decision, but something done to her. Another violation on top of the original abduction. Demeter's joy turned to anguish. The hymn doesn't describe her immediate reaction in detail, but we can infer it from what came next. Zeus had to formally decree the compromise. The reunion would not be complete or permanent. The bond created by eating underworld food could not be broken, and Persephone would have to return to Hades for part of each year. This was the compromise Zeus decreed. Persephone would spend 1/3 of each year with Hades in the underworld, and 2/3 with Demeter in the upper world. Different ancient sources describe this division variously, with later traditions often settling on 6 months each for symbolic neatness. But the principle remained constant. Persephone would move between worlds, serving as a bridge between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, spending part of each year in each domain, belonging completely to neither, and partially to both. This was the compromise Zeus decreed, the solution to a problem that had nearly destroyed the mortal world and disrupted the entire cosmic order. Persephone would not be wholly Hades' bride, imprisoned year-round in the underworld, nor would she be wholly restored to her mother, returned to the eternal spring of her youth as if nothing had happened. Instead, she would move between worlds, serving as a bridge between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, spending part of each year in each domain, belonging completely to neither and partially to both. And with this division came the explanation for something that had not existed before, the seasons themselves. But here's where we need to be careful about how we understand this myth in its original Mediterranean context. The ancient Greeks didn't experience 4 equal seasons the way northern climates do. Mediterranean agriculture follows a different pattern entirely. A long, hot, dry summer when nothing much grows and fields lie barren, followed by autumn rains that allow planting, mild wet winters when seeds germinate, underground, and spring when crops grow and ripen before the cycle begins again. When the Homeric Hymn describes Demeter's sorrow making the earth barren and her joy making it bloom, we might imagine winter snow and spring flowers. But the text itself suggests something different. The barren time corresponds to when Persephone descends to the underworld, which, based on the agricultural context and later Greek festival calendars, appears to have been late spring or summer, the dry season when Mediterranean farmers couldn't plant anyway. Her return in autumn or early winter coincided with the rainy season when planting began and the earth became fertile again. This means the myth explained not the northern European pattern of winter, spring, summer, fall, but the Mediterranean pattern of dry barrenness, followed by wet fertility. When Persephone returned to be with Demeter, it wasn't necessarily spring in our sense, but rather the beginning of the agricultural year, when rain allowed seeds to be planted and growth could begin. When she descended to Hades, the earth became parched and barren, corresponding to the long Mediterranean summer when nothing grows and farmers wait for autumn rains. The hymn makes this clear when it describes what happened after the compromise. Demeter of the beautiful crown made fruit to spring up from the rich lands, so that the whole wide earth was laden with leaves and flowers. This abundance came when Persephone returned, and it allowed humanity to survive. The goddess, having secured her daughter's partial return, relented from her strike and allowed agriculture to resume, though now on a new pattern shaped by Persephone's comings and goings. So the seasons were born, not as we might imagine them today, but as the Greeks experienced them. Periods of fertility and barrenness, times when Demeter rejoiced at her daughter's presence, and times when she mourned her absence. The world itself shaped by the relationship between these two. Goddesses, by their love and separation and reunion. The ancient Greeks understood this as the fundamental explanation for the agricultural cycle that governed their lives. The Mediterranean climate does not have 4 equal seasons in the way that more northern climates do. Instead, it has a long, dry summer when crops ripen and are harvested, followed by a period when the earth is barren and farmers wait for the autumn rains to allow planting again. The myth of Demeter and Persephone gave divine meaning to this cycle, transforming it from a simple fact of nature into a story about love and loss, about the bond between mother and daughter, about the compromise between death and life that allows existence to continue. But the myth was more than an explanation for seasonal change. It spoke to deep human concerns about separation and reunion, about the inevitability of change, about how those we love must sometimes go where we cannot follow, and about the grief that comes with that. Separation, a grief so profound it can feel like the world itself is ending. Demeter's loss of Persephone and Persephone's descent into the underworld became metaphors for every separation, every transition, every moment when someone we love moves beyond our ability to protect them or keep them close. And the reunion, the return, became a promise that separation does not have to be permanent, that even in the face of death itself, connection can endure, that love can survive the journey between worlds. The Queen of the Dead. Something remarkable happened to Persephone during her time in the underworld, a transformation that the ancient sources acknowledge but never fully explain. The maiden who had been dragged weeping into Hades' realm, who yearned constantly for her mother and the world above, who was described as shy and reluctant and suffering, somehow became the dread queen of the dead, a figure of power and authority in her own right, respected and feared by gods and mortals alike. This transformation is reflected even in her names. She had been Kor, the maiden, defined entirely by her youth and potential. But after her time below, she was Persephone, a name whose etymology is uncertain, but that the Greeks associated with the destructive power of death and the sacred mystery of the underworld. Homer calls her Dread Persephone, and in his epics, she rules beside Hades with authority over all the dead, judging souls, making decisions about the inhabitants of the underworld, exercising power that seems to be hers by right, rather than merely borrowed from her husband. How did this transformation occur? The ancient texts don't tell us explicitly, but we can piece together a picture from fragments and implications scattered across different sources. Persephone spent months, in some versions years, in the underworld before her first return to the surface. During that time, she was not simply a prisoner in a cell, but the queen of a kingdom, seated beside its king, witnessing the arrival of every new soul, observing the judgment and fate of the dead, becoming intimately familiar with the structures and rhythms of a realm that most living beings could barely imagine. She learned, in other words, what it meant to be dead, what happened to souls after they left their bodies, how the underworld functioned as a system of afterlife and judgment and eternal dwelling. This knowledge set her apart from all the other Olympian gods except Hades himself. Zeus might rule the heavens, Poseidon the seas, but neither of them truly understood death from the inside, as an experienced reality rather than an abstract concept. Persephone, by virtue of her months below, gained wisdom that no other young deity possessed, a kind of knowing that came from dwelling in the darkness, from sitting on the throne of the dead, from becoming intimately familiar with mortality itself. Some later sources suggest that her relationship with Hades evolved over time from captor and captive to something more complex. There are hints of partnership, of mutual respect, even of a kind of love that grew not from the initial abduction, which remained a violation, no matter how later sources might romanticize it, but from shared rule and shared understanding of their domain. Persephone became, in these accounts, not just a victim who escaped part-time, but a queen who chose to return, who had power and authority in the underworld that she could not exercise in the realm above, who found meaning in her role as guardian and judge of the dead, even as she continued to treasure her time with her mother in the world of light. This interpretation is complicated and troubling in some ways. It risks romanticizing an abduction, suggesting that Persephone somehow came to love her captor, falling into patterns that modern readers recognize as deeply problematic. But the ancient Greeks were less interested in modern concepts of consent and trauma than in the emgenosis. Transformation itself, the way that terrible experiences can change us, the way we can claim power in situations we did not choose, the way we can become queens of our own underworlds, even when we started as captive maidens. Persephone's authority in the underworld was real and recognized by all the other gods. When heroes like Orpheus or Heracles descended to the realm of the dead seeking special dispensation, to reclaim a lost love or complete an impossible labor, they had to petition both Hades and Persephone, recognizing her as a co-ruler with genuine power to grant or deny their requests. When Odysseus traveled to the underworld to consult the dead prophet Tiresias, he encountered Persephone as a figure of awe and terror, a goddess who commanded the shades and could compel the dead to speak or remain silent according to her will. She was also associated with the Erinyes, the Furies, ancient spirits of vengeance, who pursued those who committed grave crimes, particularly those who harmed family members. In some traditions, the Erinyes answered to Persephone, carrying out her judgments, executing her will in matters of blood guilt and familial betrayal. This connection emphasized her role as a goddess of justice in the realm of death, someone who ensured that the dead received what they deserved, that crimes did not go unpunished simply because the criminal had died, that cosmic order extended even into the shadowy afterlife. The later tradition also suggested that Persephone had some influence over the living through her domain over seeds and new growth. As a goddess who descended into the earth and returned, she became associated with the agricultural cycle, not just as Demeter's daughter, but in her own right. A deity of seeds, buried in dark soil, who would emerge as sprouting plants when spring came. She was death and rebirth in one figure, the seed that must fall into the ground and seem to die before it can grow into new life. The promise that death is not the end, but a transition, a necessary darkness before the return of light. Modern interpretations often emphasize Persephone's transformation as a coming-of-age story, a myth about the passage from girlhood to womanhood, from innocence to experience, from being entirely defined by your relationship with your mother, to becoming your own person, with your own power and authority. In this reading, the descent to the underworld represents the necessary separation that must occur for growth to happen, the painful but essential process of leaving childhood behind, even when that leaving involves loss and grief and fear. The return is not a return to what was, but a new relationship, a mature connection between mother and daughter who have both been changed by the separation, who must find a new way of being together that acknowledges that neither of them is who she was before. These interpretations are more modern than ancient, reading contemporary concerns about autonomy and identity into a myth that the Greeks understood primarily as explaining the seasons and founding the Eleusinian Mysteries. But myths are living things, capable of speaking to different generations in different ways, and Persephone's story has proven remarkably flexible, able to carry meanings about loss and power, about victimhood and agency, about the complex ways we respond to trauma, and how we claim authority in situations we did not choose. What remains constant across all interpretations is that the maiden who descended was not the same as the queen who returned. Persephone had been transformed by her time in the underworld, and that transformation was permanent and irreversible. Even when she walked in the upper world beside her mother, she carried the knowledge of death with her, the wisdom of darkness, the authority of one who had ruled the dead and would rule them again. When her time above was finished, and she descended once more to take her throne beside Hades in the shadowed realm, below. The Mysteries of Eleusis. While Demeter had been grieving and searching for her daughter, while the world had been withering under her neglect, she had come to Eleusis, and there she had promised to teach sacred rites to the people who had shown her kindness. These rites would become the Eleusinian Mysteries, perhaps the most important religious experience in all of ancient Greece. Ceremonies that continued for nearly 2,000 years and that transformed the lives of everyone who participated in them. The mysteries were initiation rites, secret ceremonies that promised participants a blessed afterlife and freedom from the fear of death. Anyone who spoke Greek could be initiated, regardless of gender or social status, though slaves needed their master's permission. The details of what actually happened during the initiation were kept secret on pain of death, and remarkably, that secrecy was maintained throughout the mystery's entire history. We have initiation lists showing who participated and when. We have architectural remains of the buildings where the ceremonies took place. We have references in literature to the transformative power of the experience. But we do not have detailed descriptions of what the initiates saw, heard, or did in the sacred halls of Eleusis. What we do know is that the mysteries reenacted, in some way, the myth of Demeter and Persephone. Initiates walked the sacred way from Athens to Eleusis, a journey of about 14 miles that recreated Demeter's search for her lost daughter. They fasted, purified themselves, drank a sacred beverage called kykeon, made from barley and mint, and then entered the telesterion, a massive hall that could accommodate thousands of people, where the actual mysteries were revealed. Ancient writers who participated in the mysteries speak of them with extraordinary reverence. The philosopher Cicero wrote that the mysteries taught not only how to live joyfully, but also how to die with better hope. The poet Pindar claimed that those who had been initiated know the end of life and its God-given beginning. The playwright Sophocles wrote that those who had witnessed the mysteries were thrice blessed, and that they alone would have true life in the afterlife, while others would suffer. These were not fringe cult members, but mainstream educated Greeks who considered the Eleusinian experience central to their spiritual lives. The mysteries seem to have involved three elements, often summarized in ancient sources as things said, things shown, and things done. The things said probably included the recitation of the sacred myth, the story of Demeter and Persephone told in a ritual context. The things shown likely involve the revelation of sacred objects, possibly including a sheaf of wheat that represented both Demeter's gift of agriculture and the cycle of death and rebirth symbolized by seeds planted in the earth. The things done might have included ritual actions, performed by the initiates themselves, though exactly what these actions were remains unknown. One clue to what the initiates experienced comes from a fragment of an ancient text that gives the password initiates had to speak upon entering the final stage of initiation. I have fasted. I have drunk the kykeon. I have taken things from the sacred chest, and after performing a rite, I have placed them in the basket. Then I took them from the basket and put them back in the chest. This cryptic statement tells us that handling sacred objects was part of the ceremony, but not what those objects were, or what significance the handling carried. Some modern scholars have suggested that the kykeon might have contained ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and has psychoactive properties, and that the initiates underwent a drug-induced visionary experience in the darkened telesterion. This theory is controversial and unprovable, but it would explain the profound impact the mysteries had, participants and the difficulty they had in describing what they experienced, since visions and mystical states are notoriously hard to capture in words. Whether the experience was chemically enhanced or purely spiritual, the result was consistent across centuries and thousands of initiates. Those who participated in the Eleusinian Mysteries came away transformed, believing they had been given insight into the nature of death and the promise of blessed afterlife. They had, in some sense, experienced Persephone's journey, descending into darkness and emerging again into light, dying symbolically and being reborn, learning that death was not an end, but a transition, a movement from one state to another, part of a cycle as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons. The connection to the myth of Demeter and Persephone was explicit. The Mysteries celebrated Demeter's gift of agriculture, which allowed civilization to exist, and her gift of the sacred knowledge, which allowed the individuals to transcend the fear of death. They honored Persephone as a goddess who had descended to death and returned, who knew both realms and could guide souls through the transition between them. They reenacted the core truth of the myth, that separation is painful but not permanent, that descent into darkness is followed by return to light, that even in the face of death, there is hope for reunion and renewal. The sanctuary at Eleusis became one of the most important religious sites in all of Greece. The road from Athens to Eleusis was the only paved road in central Greece for centuries, a testimony to how many people made that journey every year. The Mysteries were celebrated annually in September, at the time when seeds would be planted for the next growing season, when Persephone was about to descend to the underworld, and winter was approaching, making the timing itself a ritual acknowledgement of the myth's seasonal significance. The Mysteries continued until the late 4th century of the Common Era, when the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius banned pagan practices and the sanctuary was destroyed. For nearly 2,000 years, generation after generation of Greeks had walked that sacred path, drunk the kykeon, witnessed the revelation in the telesterion, and come away transformed. The philosopher Aristotle, the orator Cicero, the emperor Marcus Aurelius, countless thousands whose names we don't know, all shared this experience. All carried the secret knowledge that Demeter had promised to share when she first came to Eleusis in her grief, searching for her stolen daughter. Echoes through time. The myth of Hades and Persephone became one of the most enduring stories from ancient Greece, retold and reinterpreted across millennia, speaking to each generation in language it could understand about concerns that never quite fade: love and loss, power and powerlessness, the relationship between mothers and daughters, the meaning of death, the possibility of transformation. The agricultural symbolism was never far from the surface. For the ancient Greeks, who lived in a world where famine was a constant threat and survival depended entirely on successful harvests. The myth explained the most fundamental pattern of their existence. It gave divine meaning to the cycle of planting and harvest, barrenness and abundance. When crops failed, it was because Demeter was mourning. When the rains came and seeds began to sprout, it was because Persephone had returned. The world itself was shaped by the relationship between these two goddesses, by their love and separation and reunion. But the myth also spoke to emotional and psychological truths that transcended its agricultural context. The bond between Demeter and Persephone represented the mother-daughter relationship in its most intense form. A love so profound that its disruption could unmake the world. Demeter's grief was every mother's grief at the loss of a child, magnified to cosmic proportions. Her search was every parent's desperate attempt to find what has been taken, to restore what has been broken, to undo the terrible change that has separated them from someone they love more than life itself. And Persephone's transformation spoke to the universal experience of leaving home, of being thrust into circumstances we did not choose, of growing up and becoming someone different from who we were, someone our former selves might not recognize. The maiden who picked flowers in eternal spring could never return to that innocence once she had eaten the pomegranate seeds, once she had ruled the dead, once she had become queen of the underworld. She had been changed by her experiences in ways that could not be undone. And while she could return to her mother's embrace, she could never return to being simply Core, simply the daughter, simply the child. She had become Persephone, complex and powerful, and forever marked by her time below. Later interpretations emphasized different aspects of the myth depending on the concerns of the era. Medieval and Renaissance Christians sometimes saw Persephone as a prototype for the resurrection, a figure who descended into death and returned to life, prefiguring Christ's journey to hell and triumphant return. Romantic poets saw her as a symbol of the soul's descent into darkness and its yearning for light. Victorian writers emphasized the purity of the mother-daughter bond and the violation of Persephone's innocence, often omitting or downplaying Hades' role to make the story more suitable for their sensibilities. Modern feminist scholars and writers have reclaimed the myth as a story about female power and autonomy, focusing on Persephone's transformation from victim to queen, on Demeter's refusal to accept the patriarchal order that gave away her daughter without her consent, on the way the two goddesses ultimately defined their relationship on their own terms, rather than accepting Zeus's or Hades' dictates. In these readings, the pomegranate seeds become a symbol not of entrapment, but of choice, however constrained, and Persephone's divided year becomes a model for how women navigate between different demands and different roles, finding power in both, even when they would prefer to choose just one. The myth has also been read as an initiation story, a symbolic representation of the transition from childhood to adulthood that every person must undergo. The descent to the underworld represents the death of the child's self and the painful process of becoming an adult with knowledge and responsibilities the child never had. The pomegranate seeds mark the irreversibility of this transition. Once you have tasted adult knowledge and responsibility, you cannot return to the innocence of childhood. The cycle of descent and return represents the ongoing negotiation between past and present, between who we were and who we have become, a negotiation that continues throughout our lives. Archaeological evidence from across the Mediterranean world shows the persistence of Demeter and Persephone worship. Temples and sanctuaries in Greece, Italy, and Sicily bear witness to the goddess's importance. Votive offerings, inscriptions, and artistic representations survive, showing how ordinary people engaged with these deities, asking for good harvests, for protection during pregnancy and childbirth, for blessings on marriages, for hope in the face of death. The myth lived not just in literature and philosophy, but in the daily religious practice of millions of people over thousands of years. The image of Persephone being abducted became one of the most common subjects in ancient Greek and Roman art. Vase paintings, reliefs, mosaics, and sculptures showed Hades seizing the terrified maiden while her companions fled, showed her journey in the chariot to the underworld, showed her seated beside Hades on the throne of the dead. These images served both as illustrations of a familiar story and as reminders of the myth's continuing relevance, its ability to speak to fundamental human experiences of loss and change. And always, beneath the surface, was the promise of the mysteries, the secret knowledge that initiated thousands believed would transform their understanding of death and give them hope for a blessed afterlife. Though we don't know exactly what that knowledge was, we know it was connected to the story of Demeter and Persephone, to the idea that descent is followed by return, that death is part of a cycle rather than an ending, that love can survive even the journey to the underworld and back. Eternal return. As we draw toward the close of our journey through this ancient myth, let your breathing deepen. Let the weight of these stories settle around you like a gentle blanket. We began with a question. What could be powerful enough to make thousands of people keep a secret for 2,000 years? What did the initiates at Eleusis witness that transformed them so completely? We'll never know the specific rituals or exact visions. The secret was kept, but we can now understand what that secret meant, what truth it revealed that was powerful enough to conquer the fear of death. The myth of Hades and Persephone isn't really about the changing seasons, or rather, it's not only about that. The seasons are what happens, but they're not what the myth means. Think about what we've discovered in this journey. A maiden who picked flowers in eternal spring was dragged to the underworld, transformed against her will into a queen of the dead. She couldn't return completely, but she couldn't be kept entirely. She became something new, something that had never existed before, a being who belonged to both life and death, who moved between the worlds, who was changed utterly by her descent, but who returned nevertheless. That's what the Eleusinian Mysteries taught. Not that death isn't real or frightening, but that it's not the end. You descend into darkness, and you return transformed. The seed that falls into the earth seems to die, but it emerges as new life. Persephone was dragged unwilling into death's realm, but she came back as a queen with power beyond anything core the maiden had ever possessed. Death and transformation and return, locked in an eternal cycle that mirrors the natural world and the mysteries promised, the fate of human souls. Here's the final revelation, the truth that recontextualizes everything we've explored tonight. The Eleusinian Mysteries didn't show initiates a happy ending. They showed them Persephone's journey as a pattern, as something that happens to everyone. We all lose our innocence. We all descend into experiences we didn't choose. We all eat the pomegranate seeds that bind us to darkness we can never completely escape. We're all transformed in ways that mean we can never return to who we were before. But the mysteries promised that this descent isn't the end of the story. Persephone returns. The seed sprouts. Death gives way to life in an eternal cycle. The initiates witness this truth not as abstraction, but as lived experience, as ritual that made them participants in Persephone's journey, that let them descend and return, that showed them in the darkness of the telesterion, that they, like her, would emerge again. And that's why Hades isn't the villain of this story. Not really. He's death itself, inevitable and inexorable, but not evil. He's the darkness we must all enter. He's the transformation that frightens us because it's irreversible. Because once you've been to the underworld, once you've eaten those seeds, you can never be the innocent maiden picking flowers in eternal spring. You're changed, marked, bound to both worlds. But you also have power you never had before. Knowledge purchased at terrible cost. but real nevertheless. The wisdom that comes from dwelling in darkness and emerging again. Demeter isn't just a grieving mother, though. She is that. She's the principle that fights against death, that refuses to accept loss, that threatens to unmake the world rather than accept that what we love must sometimes go where we cannot follow. Her rage and grief are righteous, are appropriate, are powerful enough to move even Zeus. But even she, goddess of life and growth, cannot prevent the descent. She can only ensure the return, can only negotiate a compromise that allows connection to continue across the boundary between worlds. And Zeus, who started this disaster by giving away his daughter without her or her mother's consent. The myth doesn't absolve him, but it does suggest that even the mistakes of the powerful, even the tragedies born from treating people as property, even the violence that seems to destroy everything, can be transformed into something that creates meaning. Winter was born from violation, yes, but it's also part of the cycle now, necessary and natural. The darkness that makes spring's return significant. That's the secret the mysteries taught, the knowledge that couldn't be spoken, but could only be experienced. You will descend, and you will return. You will be separated from what you love, and you will be reunited, though the reunion will not erase what you've experienced. You will die to one way of being and be born into another. You will eat seeds in the darkness that bind you to it, but you will also rise again to the light, transformed, carrying the wisdom of both worlds, queen and maiden, powerful and vulnerable, forever moving between the realms. The ancient Greeks who walked from Athens to Eleusis each September, who drank the Kikeon and entered the darkened Telesterion, who witnessed whatever revelation was shown there, came away transformed, not because they learned they would avoid death, but because they learned death was part of the pattern. Persephone's descent and return promised not exemption from suffering, but meaning within it. Not escape from transformation, but purpose through it. Sleep well, knowing that the pattern continues. Somewhere between the world of light and the realm of shadows, Persephone moves eternally, queen of both, belonging to both, teaching us that we, too, can dwell in darkness and light, that we, too, can be transformed and still return, that we, too, are part of the great cycle that the Greeks saw in this story and made sacred in their mysteries. The narcissus blooms, the earth opens, the journey begins again, as it always has, as it always will. Rest in that knowledge, rest in that promise. Rest knowing that even the darkest descent carries the promise of return, that even the most unwilling transformation can lead to power beyond imagining, that even loss so profound, it threatens to unmake the world, can be survived, can be endured, can become part of a larger pattern that gives meaning to existence itself. Before there was winter, there was only spring. But spring without winter is not paradise. It's stagnation, unchanging sameness, endless light that never deepens into wisdom. The maiden who picked flowers in eternal spring had to descend to become the queen who rules with knowledge of both life and death. We had to learn loss to understand reunion. We had to taste darkness to value light. And that is why this myth endures. Not because it's comfortable or simple or fair, but because it's true. True to how transformation feels. True to how loss shapes us. True to how we survive, by moving between worlds, by holding light and darkness both, by being, like Persephone herself, maidens and queens, innocent and wise, bound to death, but returning always to life. Good night, and may your dreams carry you through descent and return, through darkness and light, through the eternal cycle that shaped the seasons and shapes us still, that made winter possible and spring meaningful, that promises every separation will end in reunion, every death in transformation, every descent in return. The mystery continues. The secret is kept. But now you know what it meant, even if you can never know exactly what it was. You know that Persephone moves between worlds. You know that Demeter's love creates the seasons. You know that death is not the end, but a transition, and that we, like the maiden who became queen, are more than we were, and will become more than we are. Rest, transform, return.